price. Well, maybe the last thing I could just see if any of you have some suggestions. We just had one there, really, which is sort of to have a more coordinated approach between the governments. One thing about housing that's a little different than some of those other things you mentioned is there's no ability to control. You know, your rent is your rent, and you can't control that. It's controlled by a third party. Whereas some of the other things you can change the amount of some of these bills with some modifications to your own habits, but even that's at the margins. But rent, you have no control. You have to pay whatever it is that you've agreed to pay. Anybody want to talk about what they would like to see the governments do? I'll tell you what we've done here for starters, and we've had to do it more or less on our own because as yet we haven't had the kind of partnership yet that we need from the other governments. Is we've put up some city land, for example, and we've said if developers come forward and they commit themselves to developing affordable housing, and in some cases, most cases, affordable rental housing, which will include units that are big enough to have a family, or affordable ownership options, that we will, in effect, contribute that land, and furthermore, we will speed up the approval of it. We will perhaps forgive some of the fees that we charge normally when people build buildings. That helps us, frankly, to pay for parks and transit and so on, but we so much want to get this affordable housing built, we would do that. So that's the kind of thing that we've started to do, and it has a positive impact, but it's in the hundreds of units, whereas what we need to do is kind of take that up to thousands in order to address a problem that's been festering for some time. So that's an example. We've talked to the federal government about making tax allowances such that it will encourage people to build more affordable rental housing. There is something called inclusionary zoning, which the province is doing, which will mandate that any new development has to include a percentage set by the city of affordable housing, so that you say to developers you have to build what are sort of more mixed communities. So I just put those forward as 2 or 3 things that are kind of underway already or are on the table. Other things you might suggest we could do to help with the situation you all face in different ways to get yourself properly housed in the city. Who wants to go first?
So to me, I think the 2 things that I see on a daily basis that make the most sense for me would be, as you touched on, more family-style condos. I think that when I look at the way condos work now, they really do, they're more geared towards single people or people that are in couples, but I think that over time I can imagine that more and more families are just have to start sort of living in those type of environments. And the second would be like looking at programs like Options for Homes. Like those types of programs are generally, I think, pretty attractive for people that are looking to buy their first home. So I see potential opportunities there. So the last thing I'd mention is that this is very anecdotal because I haven't been involved in the business, but I actually did used to work in the finance sector, and looking at the requirements to buy a home now versus the requirements of where they were 5 years ago are very, very different. And it's actually a lot harder right now looking at down payment requirements and the amount that CMHC is able to finance those sorts of things. Like those are real things that can actually impact like whether somebody's able to buy a home again.
They're trying. This is really just by way of explanation. What they're trying to do is also make sure that people are, you know, not risk-proofed, but that there's a sort of lesser element of risk for not just for the financial system, but for the home buyer, so that if interest rates change from where they are now, which are historically low, that you wouldn't suddenly find yourself. The good news is you bought a house with a substantial mortgage. The bad news is you can't afford to meet the mortgage payment. But anyway, that's what they're trying to do.
For me, it's just seeing all 3 levels of government work together and not saying, oh, that's the municipal's role, oh, that's provincial, and that's federal. And we're starting to see that. I mean, you just made mention of the different things that they're doing, and being able to sit at the table and creating creating legislation and laws that truly don't just talk, but actually put forward proposals and ideas and actions that allow for the downtown core to be family friendly, and not just Toronto, Edmonton, Vancouver, all cities across Canada, where the reality is 80% of Canadians live in municipal downtown areas, and so just allowing for those 3 levels of government to work together to allow for families to have access to affordable housing, whether that means long-term rental, whether that means plans to eventually buy a home, whatever it may be, but actually put into action those things that you talk about and make them happen.
Okay, Vince?
I'm in complete agreement with the other two, but also we need greater foresight either from government or from builders, developers. We talked about earlier how developers said no one wanted to live in condominiums a few years back, or 2 or 3 bedroom condominiums. Now we would kill for a 3-bedroom condo. There's no foresight there, obviously. People are moving back into cities. That probably started about 10 years ago. Lack of foresight. People having families in the cities. Again, a lack of foresight. There's nowhere for families to go. And just need better foresight.
I can only tell you whether that criticism is fair or not. It may be, but they've started to recognize the reality of what you said. It used to be the city, before my time, the city sort of forced developers to include a couple of, literally like 1 or 2 3-bedroom condos downtown, and they protested and then later claimed they couldn't sell them, and then oftentimes they would actually divide them up and sell them as smaller ones. And I think they're now realizing there's a demand for this, perhaps created out of necessity, where people sort of have decided they're going to live in that life as opposed to ever getting a house. And so they're starting to offer more of those units now, but still it's a very small supply.
And I think, a different style of housing in Europe, in Scandinavian countries, their houses are smaller, and that's probably okay, but it's just a different style of living. They may be the condo style living, but at a 1,500, 2,000 square feet, I think most people in the city would be happy with 2,000 square feet or 1,500 square feet.
And it's less space to light and to heat and to all those things that we're talking about in the...
But we will enjoy that park again.
About the park, we're going to try and build that park. I'm very determined. Ayanna, comments on what you'd like to see the government do?
Yeah, I don't really have any solutions beyond what was already suggested. But I agree with, I have to piggyback on Nick in some sort of a better system for renters. As we talked about before, the idea of owning, I think we're chipping away at that whole facade that in order to be a renter is means some level of success or achievement. Renting is just as sufficient, but maybe allowing for renters to have a bit more agency, like the long-term rental agreements or a rent-to-own type situation. I think that would be a small achievement in the living situation for those of us who, I have to speak on behalf of the non-family person, those of us single people who are just trying to move our life forward.
And Amanda.
2 things, I think we touched upon them already. The first is, at a federal level, we now have to put a 20% down payment if we don't want to deal with any sort of additional fees. So any possible way to make it easier for first-time homeowners to enter the market would be great. Secondly, I mentioned this a little bit earlier about supply and demand. If the city can, and Mayor Tory, you offered a few solutions already as well, on how we can increase supply by maybe removing a lot of the red tape around building permits and accelerating the process of building, because I know that some people have said a lot of people want to build in Toronto, it's just that the process takes a very, very long time. And the supply and demand just creates increased competition, and I've seen houses listed at a certain price, and then it's just there's no rhyme or reason to what they sell for. Even going over $200,000 above asking is not uncommon. So any way to kind of address the supply and demand issue in the city would be helpful as well.
Okay, well, I want to thank, yes, please, you can have the last or second to last word, depending on who else, but go ahead, please. Somebody can hand you one of the mics so we can all hear.
Just to add to the notice suggestions, so I spent this is my first year returning back to Toronto. So I grew up in Mississauga, and then I left for Vancouver for 10 years, and this issue is not new to that city, as most of us know. One of the ideas that they started doing, I think it would really benefit people that are not just fresh out of school or roommates, but probably closer to the NIC scenario, who have families and want to move into a space that just has more space for their family, but also kind of break into the market. Was what the developers started doing was they started taking detached homes And they split them up into 4 units, and they were quite creative on how they did that. So they made like an entire floor on the ground level, and then kind of a semi above, and then they built kind of a detached unit above the garage and laneway housing. And then everyone shared the space. And when you actually bought a unit there, you bought it as a part of a stratified complex. And what that enabled you to do was actually kind of control the fees that you would pay that otherwise you'd be paying condo fees, but you control them amongst the rest of the people in your unit, in your strata, which is only a maximum of 4 others. And it really gave you access to that green space that you were looking for, and I guess like for the backyard and for all of that, kind of your family, and it was all shared. And anything that came up, if you're not handy, you'd actually have the 3 other people to kind of help you out and chip in the costs. And people would be really creative on how they maintain their property. And it really allowed for that collaboration, allowed people to return back to the city. And I know we have a large number of massive, fully detached homes that are $2.5 to $3.5 million scattered around the city. But if you split those up and kind of rezone them, it makes it accessible to move into the space. So that might be something to look at, because it really revitalized kind of the downtown areas in Vancouver. Eventually it was unaffordable because of the residents, but at the beginning it actually worked really well and really densified those areas and helped families.
That's an interesting idea. I will tell you that for somebody in my position in public life, it's a controversial proposal, because there are many people who live in some of those very same neighborhoods where you could divide up those houses and make, say 3 times $500,000 a more affordable ownership option, but the neighbors all around would object to that on the basis that it's changing the character of the neighborhood. And I'm just saying there would be quite a debate about that, but I think it's an idea that it's always worth looking at what has happened elsewhere to create affordable ownership opportunities, because that's something, again, that we talked more a little bit, as it turned out, in the discussion today about renting, but people would like to own. I think everybody at the table at one time or another said today they'd like to own if they could, but they just view sort of $1.5 million or some such number as being not attainable, at least not in the present circumstances. So that's interesting. Anybody else want to contribute? Yes, please.